The International Monetary Fund's Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, has confirmed that Ghana is seeking debt treatment under the G20 Common Framework. Now, the framework is a set of guidelines established by the Group of 20 nations to provide debt relief for countries in distress. It aims to address the issue of debt sustainability and provide a comprehensive solution for countries facing debt challenges. Ghana's request for debt treatment under the G20 Common Framework is a significant development and will be closely monitored by the international community as the process unfolds. This request also comes as Ghana continues to work through the process of getting a $3 billion bailout from the IMF. Emmanuel Amoah-Darkwah is joining me now from Accra, Ghana. He is an economist and partner at advisory firm C-Kadd Global, and we'll go through what this means for Ghana right now. Emmanuel, welcome to the show again. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as I went through that introduction, something rang out to me that I think we should start with first. When you look at the countries that have applied for this common framework, Ghana is now the 4th African country, but it's not in the same league as Ethiopia, Zambia, and even Chad, because this is a framework that's meant for poorer countries. Ghana is a cocoa producer, oil producer, gold producer as well. In terms of having Ghana approach the G20 to be part of the common framework, what do you think that says really about the issue and the situation that Ghana finds itself in when it comes to its debt?
Yeah, thank you very much. It is all about the volumes of debt Ghana has amassed and the G20 to be part of this framework, which is sort of a systematic initiative to look at debt restructuring for low-income countries. I must point out that about 60% of low-income countries in the world are facing some level of debt distress. And so it is not out of place for Ghana to apply to be part of G20 to go through this systematic debt restructuring as stipulated by this initiative.
So of the countries that have been there before, we know that Chad, all of them entered in 2021. Chad finally secured some kind of deal in late 2022. When you look at all the process and the framework around it, what do you make of the process? Because it has been one that's had a lot of criticism attached to it for the slowness and the sluggishness in the turnaround time, particularly for countries in need.
And so it's all about how speedily we can get this done. And as I indicated in the earlier comment, more than 60% of low-income countries are going through this. And as you mentioned in your preamble, Ghana is the 4th country to apply to the G20 framework. What it means is that we should look at how best the international community, both the IMF and the World Bank and G20 countries and other creditors, should look at how best they can fast-track this process. It's unfortunate that so far, the process has been long-winding. As you mentioned, Chad applied in 2021 and then just got a deal in November 2022. But if you look at the current data on our hands now, Ghana is on a debt unsustainable path. And so this process has to be faster so that Ghana can get onto a more debt sustainable path and then be able to get a deal from the IMF.
And that really was a question I was going to ask later, but I think it's the right time. When you look at how long the process has taken, even though a civil war in Ethiopia did stall that process for Ethiopia in particular, but when you look at how long it has taken, do you think Ghana and Ghanaians have the amount of time to wait that Chad took in order to get its own deal?
We have to do a critical analysis of what is going into Ghana's debt. Who are the major creditors for Ghana? And so it's going to happen on case-by-case basis. But for Ghanaians, we don't have a lot of time to spend. In December, when Ghana reached a staff-level agreement with the IMF, the only caveat for Ghana to meet now to get a board approval is to progressively get debt onto sustainable path. And so I believe that a critical analysis of Ghana's particular situation would have to be done so that we'll be able to speed up the process of getting onto debt sustainable path for us to be able to cling on to a board approval from the IMF by the first quarter of this year.
All right, so you've mentioned creditors. Let's talk about creditors in this process. So Ghana's debt restructuring under the Common Framework aims to also include non-Paris Club members, such as China, in debt relief talks. Now, do you think you see China being willing to come to the table? It's a country that's been described as understanding the lending process, but being very unversed in the sort of debt forgiveness, debt restructuring process. We see the situation that's happening in Zambia as well. China has said it's part of the process, but it seems that the slowing down of that process may be coming from China. And it's such a major creditor to many countries around the continent. With looks, you know, drilling down to how things have played out for Chad, how they're playing out for Zambia as well. Do you think China is ready to come to the table? And who else needs to be at the table to make this process successful for Ghana?
Yeah, for China, if you look at the volumes of Ghana's debt, the external component of it, China is not that heavy as compared to Zambia. So that is why I'm saying that it has to be a based case-by-case analysis of the volumes of debt and then the various creditors on our books. And for me, I think China is ready to be on board, and we have to look at how best they can all get on board to help us go through this process. But the bigger question is, how did we get here? We got here because of our expenditure valuing us against our non-performing revenue. Hence, we have to put on a lot of debt. And if you look at the external shocks, i.e. the COVID-19 pandemic and also the Russia-Ukraine war, I think these are things that have culminated into where we are now as a country or as a continent. And so I think China will be happy to come on board to look at how best we can restructure our debt onto sustainable path. And again, Eurobond creditors, I think they should also be on board. If you look at the volumes of debt Ghana holds, about $13 billion for the Eurobond sector, I believe that they should be able to be part of the negotiations to be able to speed up the process of getting, onto the sustainable path.
Okay, so when we talk about the process, a lot of us don't have a lot of understanding about it. So, Emmanuel, I want us to go to that. We've seen a little bit of what the IMF has asked of Ghana in terms of the staff level agreement. But in terms of the G20 Common Framework, what do we know about how the debt situation or how Ghana's economy also will be evaluated, will be assessed in terms of sort of the things that will check the box off to be able to get Ghana onto the initiative?
They will also be interested in knowing what government will do in terms of fiscal response, because debt sustainability or debt restructuring should not be discussed in isolation. It has to be discussed in collaboration with the various fiscal responses that government would want to, policies that government would want to take. And so for us to evaluate it, government also has to show a lot of commitment in terms of the sweeping fiscal responses to give confidence to the creditors that because of these policies that we have embarked on, we believe that our debt will be on sustainable path, so that they will be interested in either elongating the tenure of loans we have with them, and also reducing the coupon rate we have on these loans. And so it has to be evaluated based on the other fiscal reforms that government will implement, so that we'll be able to get onto, debt sustainable path in the near future.
Do you see any challenges for Ghana in terms of getting the IMF and others involved, particularly the G20, to agree to Ghana being part of the G20 Common Framework? Do you see any challenges, even if that agreement is done, in terms of Ghana being able to fulfill the requirements to see this debt sustainability track through?
The challenge we have here on our hands is time, because time is of the essence. In December 2022, we were able to get a staff level agreement. And for us to get a board level agreement, there should be progressive debt restructuring. And so if you look at the domestic side, government has to extend the deadline again. For the external side, we should be able to look at ways to speed up the process for our domestic and external creditors to be on board, to give us some level of new terms to our loans, so that government will be able to cling on to the IMF deal. So the biggest challenge we have on our hand now is time. But more importantly, as I mentioned in my earlier comment, government will also have to show a lot of commitment in terms of the fiscal reforms that will back this debt restructuring program, whether domestic or external.
So I'll take you up on that, Emmanuel. Before we look at the extension that happened yesterday, what kind of fiscal reforms are you talking about? We've seen the budget for Ghana come out. We've heard from the finance minister, I beg your pardon, as well as the president of Ghana as well, in terms of how things are going to be managed. Initially, there was no haircuts that should be expected for domestic bondholders, but the terminology and the language and the body language seems to be changing. But particularly on the fiscal reforms that Ghana needs, separate of the IMF, separate of the G20 Common Framework, that you can see down the path. This is what Ghana should do now. What do you think those reforms entail?
First of all, it has to start with cutting the size of government, because if you look at the proportion of the government size as compared to the population, I think it's a time for us to be able to cut the size of the government. Reduce the number of ministers, and also reduce the level of discretionary expenditure. The second thing is for government to review what we call the flagship programs we have in our country. That is, we have free senior high school, we have planting for food and jobs, we have one district, one factory. I think it's about time government looks at these programs again to be able to prudently manage the program in this current crisis, because there should be some level of commitment coming from the fiscal side for our creditors to be able to give us the buy-in of the level of debt restructuring we need from them. And so the two things I will single out is for us to cut the size of government and also review our flagship program so that we can make a lot of savings, because we are spending a lot of our expenditure amortizing our debt. And as I speak to you now, in the 2023 budget, the government has earmarked in excess of 52 billion to amortize our debt, which is huge as compared to the total expenditure we have in the 2023 budget.
To Monday now. So on Monday, just yesterday, news broke that Ghana was extending the deadline for the local debt swap exchange. We spoke to one of the conveners of the Individual Bondholders Forum on the exchange program, and he basically said government is fooling itself right now, that they're not really serious about solving the issue. It also seems that government is struggling to get local bondholders to accept the exchange. What options are available at this point in time? Because as of the time we were speaking to him yesterday, the Ghana Individual Bondholders Forum, they had over 100,000 people who had signed up to be represented in a legal and advisory fashion with the forum in terms of what their rights are in this situation. What options remain for government if we're going to see that local bondholders are saying no to this debt exchange program?
The first option is for government to broaden the discussion and consultation, because this is a voluntary debt exchange program. And so the various stakeholders, you want to call on them to voluntarily exchange their debt. You have to consult them. Unfortunately, in the initial memorandum, the government indicated that individual bondholders were not going to be affected by this debt exchange. But in the revised memorandum, they have been added to it. And so the first thing for government to do is to broadly consult with them. The second thing for government to do is to do a sectorial analysis of the various sectors that will be affected by the debt exchange, i.e. the banking sector, the insurance sector, the asset management space, so that on case-by-case basis, you will take the concerns of these stakeholders before you go along with the debt exchange. If you look at the banking sector, for example, a recent report that has been churned out by the Ghana Association of Bankers indicate that the total assets of banks in government bonds stood at 55 billion Ghana cedis, which is about 30% of total assets of the banks. In terms of revenue, interest revenue from banks is about 65%. And so the banks are going to be hit very hard. Asset management companies are going to be hit very hard. Individual bondholders will be hit very hard. But on these stakeholders, at this various stakeholder level, what kind of conversation is government going to have with them, so that you want to call on them to, exchange their debt for new ones? So I think the first thing government has to do is to broadly engage these stakeholders, so that the volumes of debt that they are able to give up in this exchange will not also affect their industry. I'm not sure that government wants to solve this problem by creating additional grievous problems in the sector, whether financial sector or whether the banking sector or the other sectors you can think about. And so I believe that it has to start from broader consultations with the various stakeholders that are going to be affected, so that we'll be able to get onto this, debt restructuring.
So the extension is not going to last forever. This is the second extension now in this program. Eventually, government is going to reach a point where it says, if you haven't signed up, that's it. And a lot of people are concerned about the absolute risk and the risk of loss to local bondholders. At the end of the day, what do you think is the best case scenario? I don't think this situation is going to truly have a win-win sort of situation. There's going to be some loss on one side or the other, depending on who carries how much loss. Emmanuel, what do you think is really the best case scenario, the best case solution at the end of all of this, particularly for Ghana's local bondholders, the domestic people who trusted, because that's what the convener told us yesterday. These are individuals, teachers, mothers and fathers who trusted government's zero-risk bonds and went ahead, and now government has told them, we want you to almost carry all the risk and loss on this.
Obviously, the government is going to take a hit. The other sectors are also going to take a hit, but it should be agreed on based on the impact that this risk will have on the various sectors. And so if you want to call banks to be involved in it, the volume of exposure or the risks they are going to take should not affect their businesses. And the same applies to individuals. And so it is obviously not going to be a win-win. Government is going to lose, other stakeholders are going to lose, but what is the volume of loss? And so I believe that government should be able to take a lot of these laws because they cause the problem. We have hinted or cautioned government on this path. We were borrowing and we were not investing in capital expenditure, but more important, we were doing a lot of recurrent expenditure spending, and it has caught up with us. And so government should be able to take a lot of these risks, but other stakeholders will be affected. But the level of its impact should be, they shouldn't be affected to affect or destroy the businesses of these, industry players, whether be banks, whether insurance companies, whether asset management companies. At the end of the day, they are going to take a haircut, but it should be proportionate as compared to, what government is ready to give. And as I mentioned, government at this time should be looking at sweeping fiscal reforms so that it is not only debt restructuring, but government will be able to make some savings on embarking on some fiscal reform, so that we'll be able to make savings whilst we go on, to seek for an IMF program in the near term.
All right, Emmanuel, before I let you go, my final question, what are the next steps? What do you anticipate seeing Ghana's government do next? So they've gone to the IMF, there is a staff level agreement in place, now going to the G20 for the Common Framework initiative as well, and also getting rejections from local bondholders. We also know that external bondholders also formed a creditors committee as well in December, and it just seems like there's a lot of rejection, particularly from bondholders, on government's plan. So what are the next steps for Ghana's government in regards to this debt situation?
The next step is to still broadly consult whether external creditors or domestic bondholders, because it is a voluntary debt exchange program. And this is not, for now, we are not going on the route of getting a regulation to back the program to say that if you are not exchanging your debt, you are going to, incur some level of losses. This is voluntary at this stage. So if you are calling stakeholders to shed off some level of their coupon rate or elongate the maturity of their bonds, you should be able to broadly consult. And I believe that this is the time that government should avoid the top-bottom approach in this, but should be able to take on a bottom-up approach in terms of consultation with the various stakeholders that are going to be affected by this debt restructuring, whether domestic debt restructuring or external debt restructuring.
All right, Emmanuel, we'll leave it at that for now. Ghana's situation is one we're all very much closely following, as well as the conversations with the IMF and now with the G20 on the Common Framework. So we'll be watching very closely to see how that plays out. Thank you so much, Emmanuel.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Ghana is West Africa's second largest economy, cocoa producer, gold producer, as well as oil producer. And many are wondering how an economy that was a shining light in the COVID and surely coming out of COVID has just turned the corner in just several past 2 years as so in terms of what has happened with the debt situation. But as my guest has said, many had warned the Ghanaian government about its debt borrowing pace. And now, the traditional saying is that the chickens have come home to roost, and Ghana is having to deal with the chickens and the debts that are roosting right now.